Memon, welcome. We're looking at an interesting question today. How many ministries do we really need in India to govern this country? Well, there are a lot of ministries to start with, but let's go back and look at some of the history. The history is that the original size was obviously much less than what it was. Of course, the size keeps expanding and contracting as different governments come in. The government itself, in a report in 2009, had said that it was called the 13th report of the organizational structure of the government of India. It said that the number of ministries should ideally be around 20 to 25 from the current 55. So anyway, that's the number that we are starting with. Our guests today, Subir Gokarn, Brookings India Director of Research, also Rasheed Kidwai, author of the book Sonia, A Biography, and Ashok K. Bhattacharya, editor of Business Standard, who also joining us. Thank you very much all for joining us on this India Hangout. Subir, let me begin with you. What is the ideal size of government? Now, from the point that we are a large country, over a billion plus, it could be argued that you also need large government or big government, lots of ministers, ministries, each thing split into smaller things, and all of that to run it. But on the other hand, clearly experience seems to be telling us that we've clearly become too big and unwieldy in the way we manage government in itself.
Right. Well, I think the answer to this question really has to come from trying to lay down a very clear set of objectives of what government should be doing. Only then can you get a fix on what its size should be. So I don't think the 75 versus 55 or 25 or whatever is really a very meaningful debate, because you're not imposing on that any specific objectives. If you want the government to do very little, you have a very small government. If you want the government to do more, you have to have a larger government, but then you have to figure out how best that structure can achieve it. So I think you have to look at it from two dimensions. One is the horizontal dimension, which is the number of issues which the government wants to address at the central level, at the state level, and so on. And the other is the vertical dimension. Does the government have too many levels which really impede the flow of information, which distort information going up the system, and then make implementation of decisions taken based on flawed information that much messier, that much more difficult. So I think we have to look at it from both perspectives. One is, what are the key functions that the government has to perform? Two is, what is the best structure, both in terms of integration horizontally and vertically, that will enable the government to perform these functions effectively. Now, that's a very abstract description, but I want to make it a little more concrete. And that really comes down to the recent debate that has been going on super ministries and whether we can integrate a number of functions to create better internal coordination. I think that's an idea definitely worth trying. I myself am a firm believer in the mission approach. I think to integrate and coordinate is a huge requirement in terms of achieving very complex objectives. So you need to have somebody who has oversight of domains. So you could talk of food as a domain, and you combine several ministries that are relevant. You could talk of jobs as a domain. You combine several ministries that are relevant. Talk of infrastructure or energy as domains which require you to integrate several ministries. I think that's the way to think about it. Let's look at what the objectives are. Let's look at what the right structure to achieve those objectives is, a reasonable structure, and then start to slice and dice and recombine ministries to suit that purpose. And also simultaneously, over a perhaps longer period of time, revisit the whole hierarchy, because I think the hierarchy itself right now, given the way technology assists us in information flow and processing, the hierarchy is redundant. There's too many levels, and we need to compress that very dramatically.
Right. Okay. So I think a lot of interesting points, Subir. Let me come to Ashok Bhattacharya. As someone who's looked at government, and as I was saying in the beginning, with its expansions and contractions over time, how should we define this topic today? Is in terms of, should we contract? How should we contract? Where should we contract? Vertically, horizontally, and so on.
Govind, let me start by quoting what Narendra Modi himself said, which is maximum governance and minimum government. Now, this is his agenda, and if he has to really fulfill his agenda, then linear government. Having said that, let me also say that law is against him, because currently you have a piece of legislation which actually allows any government at the center to have a council of ministers which is as large as 79 ministries. Now, which means that you can have 10% of 795 seats, including 545 of Lok Sabha, mandated 45, and 250 of Rajya Sabha. So, which means Manmohan Singh's government had actually 72 numbers of ministers, and they were still well within the norm of 79 ministers. For Mr. Modi, it's a golden opportunity. Now, if you take a look at least his cabinet ministers, you have got 28 ministers. Now, those 28 ministers, I have taken a close look at them. They can very easily be brought down to 14 without losing anything. The plus point in that 14 strong cabinet level ministers would be that your ministers of state will be more effective, can take pay closer attention to issues and events that are going to affect the ministry's functioning. So without doing much to do streamlining the ministries or anything, he can actually bring down the size of the ministry from 72 current to very easily to 58. So a 58 strong ministry, to my mind, will be easier to handle. He can monitor the government's functioning, the ministers' effectiveness more effectively. And perhaps he will have some more time to work out an arrangement with his chief ministers in different states, which Narendra Modi wants to do. So I think a reduced size of a council of ministers is very critical for Narendra Modi to deliver better governance.
Okay, I think that's very well defined, Ashok Bhattacharya. Rasheed Kidwai, let me come to you. You've, from your understanding and sense of government in the way it's moved and grown and then not perhaps grown in the last few years, what's your sense of the subject? How do you think we should define it, coming from your perspective, which is to look at the politics of it?
Yeah, actually, there are several ways of looking at it, but the whole thing is political. We don't, as Mr. Bhattacharya has correctly described, there is a provision that you can have 15% of ministers. Now, there are so many aspirants are there. There are so many, sort of symbolic things are there on the basis of caste, region. Remember, India is a huge country, and the fruits of victory, in the sense of BJP's victory or Narendra Modi's victory, there are so many people who are expected to be rewarded. There is a huge sense of expectation. So I think Mr. Modi has very difficult choice in the sense of accommodating these aspirations, because remember, he's got just one shot, in the sense that whatever he wants to do, even if he wants to reduce it, he can reduce it now in the first chance. He can't do it this kind of thing 6 months later or a year later or so. Second thing is that in the context of Mr. Narendra Modi, we must look at it that he alone has got a chance to have a kind of a zero base, in the sense that he can set some rules. He will not be boggy of what Atal Bihari Vajpayee had done, or what Manmohan Singh did, or what Indira Gandhi had done. So in that case, in that sense, Mr. Narendra Modi has a both kind of responsibility and an opportunity to streamline a lot of things. Now, when we talk about the actual ministry formation, it depends what Mr. Modi wants, because there are so many ministries. There is a lot of need for a lot of reforms, but the problem is that we don't have a kind of administrative reforms commission report or something like that. That is, so I would have preferred that in meantime, that is from 16 to now onward, Mr. Modi could have set up a team of experts who could have gone into this and given him some kind of basis, because it cannot be just on the basis of his whims and fancies.
Right. Okay, Rasheed, so a quick historical perspective, if I may get from you. Is the expansion in government and the creation of so many ministries and obviously positions to so many ministers and members of parliament, is that because of the coalition era and as we saw in the last few decades?
Yeah, coalition era is definitely there, but you see, if he has to have in his cabinet, he has to have a couple of women members. He has to have representation from east, from west, from south, from north. He has to have somebody from scheduled caste, from scheduled tribe, and then there is of course this the big four and all those things are there. That itself will take the tally to about 20 or so. So I don't think he has a great choice. Mr. Bhattacharya is right that Mr. Modi wants, he can pull it to 15. But in real terms, I think it's going to be a very difficult task, because there are so many ministers who would not be willing to become, so many BJP politicians and newly elected MPs who would not be, looking to become Minister of State or or Deputy Minister. So in terms of cabinet ministers, he has to have 2022 posts for them. To be very least, I'm speaking from a practical, from a kind of reporter on beat, that kind of approach.
Okay, fair enough. So, Ashok Bhattacharya, let me come back to you on this. What's the solution here then? If you're saying that the optimum, if measured from an administrative efficiency point of view, is about 14, 15, what Rasheed is saying is that practically it's unlikely to go below 2022, but even that seems to be a question mark, because there are so many people who have to be kept happy. So, is it then really a realpolitik issue and debate here rather than anything else?
Well, I am looking at it politically as well. This is a government that is going to be led by a party which can on its own form the government, which will have its majority on its own. Now, this has not happened in the last 30 years, and which is what has been happening, that the party in power, which is leading the coalition, has been under the pressures of coalition dharma, of how you address the concerns of different coalition partners. And even there have been cases where Memon has had to accept a minister from a coalition partner because he has to address their concerns. Now, here is a prime minister elect as of now, who is on his own party, can actually take a tough call in reducing the number of aspirants who would have to be given a berth in the cabinet. Now, if he fails to do that, I think the message that will go out is that the government, which came with a clear mandate and yet could not implement the first sign of reform in administration and governance. So I think if he fails to act in terms of reducing the size of his ministry, then I would say that there has been no change, at least in his first major decision in governance.
Right, and I think that's a very interesting point. Subir, let me put that to you as well. So, as Ashok Bhattacharya defines it, he says this is the first sign that a incoming government could show of its commitment to improving governance. And Ashok Bhattacharya also started off by saying that Modi's point about delivering governance being paramount. So, if that's the context in which we are looking at this subject, what would you expect? That was for you, Subir.
Oh, sorry. Could you just repeat the last part of the question? I lost.
Yeah, no. So the question is, if we are defining, as Ashok Bhattacharya said, the larger point is that this is a key sign that this government is committed to administrative reform and delivering governance, which is of course an important Modi position and positioning. If that's the case, then how do we? I mean, what do we expect, and how do we sort of treat this subject?
Well, I think the commitment is obviously very, very visible in both the campaign and in the more recent post-election statements about about people jockeying for power, lobbying for positions, and so on, where there is clearly a pushback. And this suggests that he is going to be quite willing to draw the line and not pander to multiple interests, which is typically the way in which cabinets get made or ministries get made. Not the cabinet, at least the Minister of States. So I think there are two issues here. One is I like the idea of cabinet ministers having larger domains, but then having very sort of empowered and effective ministers of state to handle the subdomains within each larger aggregation. So far, certainly in my memory, the Minister of State position has been essentially a decorative one, except for the independent charge, but that's not been very frequent. So you're wasting a position, you're wasting public funds if you're not getting productivity from that very important position. So if you're able to look at the cabinet really as the sort of high strategy and internally coordinated. So it's relatively small, so it's it's easier to coordinate. And the Minister of State as the operators, so the CEO COO divide, if I were to put it in those relatively corporate terms. I think that is a starting point for a relatively effective delivery mechanism. It's not going to solve all the whole bunch of other issues that you have to deal with, but I think using, from the Prime Minister's perspective, having the most efficient arrangement within the cabinet and at the sub-cabinet level, having people who are all in a position to deliver and align themselves with the larger, governance and development objectives. I think that's very important, and so that has to be the primary criterion by which the choice is made. And obviously, he has the numbers to be able to assert that. He does not have to pander. He does not have to accommodate. He can just say, "Look, I'm doing this in the interests of delivering on my promise," and that's it. Tough. If you don't make it, there'll be another chance. If somebody messes up, other people will, always there waiting in line for people who don't deliver.
Okay,
but that's the way it should.
Questions coming in, so Shruti asked, and let me put this to Ashok Bhattacharya and then Subir, isn't an efficiency, or rather isn't an efficient bureaucracy the most important thing? And I guess that's a loaded question, because that also asks, in a way, is the bureaucracy capable of delivering, and therefore should we be talking more about the bureaucracy that will deliver rather than the ministers and the cabinets that will get created? Ashok Bhattacharya, can you start first?
Yes, bureaucracy is important, a critical tool. But I think in our system of governance, the ministers are equally, if not more important. And if you have ministers with a larger mandate, clearer mandate, integrated ministries, surely the guidelines, the orders, the administrative mandate that will flow down will be more effective. So I think I'm not arguing for inefficient or unwieldy bureaucracy. I think the starting point would be to have a lean council of ministers, a smaller cabinet, maybe at number of 14 cabinet ministers, which will mean that the smaller number of ministers will be able to exercise better control and monitoring of these bureaucrats. Because after all, bureaucrats have been mandated under the Indian system to act according to the ministerial wishes and directives. So you cannot say that the bureaucrats alone will be able to bail you out in terms of governance.
Okay, so Subir, here, is this an opportunity to reinvent some things? For instance, the Air India equation, right? So where the Air India, the airline, has a CEO, or the company has a CEO or a managing director, but the decision, and almost every decision down to minutiae, is really taken by the minister, who also acts like a spokesperson for the airline.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the dangers with having large ministries is everybody wants to assert more and more control, more and more, authority, discretion over everything that lies within the domain. So clearly, I think a larger question, and this relates directly to the Air India example, but I think there is a larger structural issue in government, is what is the role of the PSUs, particularly the banks. We've seen the recommendations recently of the Dr. P.J. Naik led committee, actually recommending that the management and governance of banks be one step removed from the finance ministry. And I think this is a more general valid point about separating PSUs from the control of ministries, because PSUs are like any other businesses in theory. They should be able to run their businesses within the parameters of whatever laws and regulations there are governing that particular sector. But to be used as instruments of discretion to hand out patronage, to
right, and Subir, but that's an important point, that's really and that's a very important point, because this move, I mean, the Naik report has also faced much criticism from the unions, and that obviously leads me to the next question, which is that moves to shrink ministries or merge them are going to, it's not just about ministers who might feel left out, but it's also the bureaucrats and the rank and file which might protest and and drag their feet.
your audio is being interrupted, so I wasn't able to get the question.
Right. No. So my question was, to taking up from the point about the Naik committee report, that which faced a lot of resistance from the unions. We are also saying, therefore the same thing would apply to government as well. It's not about just ministers getting slots, but it's also the larger bureaucracy and the rank and file which might resist and be opposed to such, shrinkages and so on.
Yeah. Well, let's not forget that at least in the banking system, but I think this applies to government as a whole, there is a huge demographic opportunity materializing. Government, public sector employment gathered momentum in the late 60s and early 70s. It sort of plateaued out for a decade and a half after that. But a lot of the early recruits in the sort of nationalization fervor are actually retiring, and the banking system will see a very substantial, I forget the estimates, but I think it's somewhere around 30% of its workforce retiring over the next 5 years. This will perhaps a little less so, but also similar orders of magnitude for the public sector as a whole. So, there are issues there about pension liabilities and so on, but that's a separate story. But I think for the moment, this is really the best opportunity we've had ever to undertake significant administrative, organizational governance reform, because even though there may be resistance, the numbers are dwindling and there isn't really any, you can't retire and offer resistance. You can only offer resistance if you're in office. So I think some sort of a compact has to be struck here that, look, this is how things are going to be. We have to get real now. We move with the times. And we're going to use this opportunity to restructure as painfully as possible for the people who are in there.
Right.
You bear the burden a little bit in terms of redundancy and excessive costs and so on. But over time, over the next 10 years, many of them will retire. So retirement attrition is offering an opportunity at this point in time, which I think the government has to take full advantage of.
Right. Rasheed, how do you see it between, let's say, the political, the realpolitik of accommodating ministers, members of parliament and so on, versus, the government itself in all its entrenched glory? How do you keep everyone happy and satisfied and yet achieve the larger targets of efficiency and delivering better governance?
That's the real test of Mr. Narendra Modi and his leadership. As I said before, if he's starting with a zero base, this is the one and only chance he's getting to reform whatever he wants to do. Let me give you a concrete example. For instance, look at Ministry of Home Affairs. It's a huge ministry. It has from promotion of Hindi language to internal security to all sorts of schedules. They have to they look after all these things. Now, if the ministry is without internal security portfolio, now which weighty or senior cabinet minister or BJP stalwart would be willing to take that assignment? Take HRD, Rajiv Gandhi did with a lot of promise. I don't want to get into all that, but in nutshell, now there is a thinking that education should be separate from HRD. Now, if education is taken away from Ministry of Human Resource Development, what will it have? Similarly, in defense, there is a lot of things about about disinvestment and involving private players. And similarly, look at Ministry of say there is a move that to let us integrate various ministries dealing with transport, be it civil aviation, railways, shipping, surface transport, all that. Now, how do you do it? If the government's intent is just to play as a regulatory body, it's fine. But if it wants to control bureaucracy, it wants to control resources, then it's a very different kind of story. As I said, I can give you example from each and every department or ministry. But this is long and short of it. This is a call that Mr. Narendra Modi will have to take.
Right. Ashok Bhattacharya, let me come back to you. And there's a question here. In some ways, it encompasses what we just spoke about. Shouldn't the government ministries need to be structured based on independencies of different functions, for example, commerce, and MEA or culture, and of course clubbing all 4 transport ministers would create better infrastructure development. So keep the objective first and then work towards what you can club together. Okay, I think we lost Ashok Bhattacharya. Subir, did you hear that question and do you want to respond on that?
Yes, I think there's a broad validity to that point that clubbing areas with significant overlaps is really how you make organizations work. You internalize the externalities, the spillover, so to speak. So, commerce and MEA clearly have a fit if you're looking at economic factors as the cornerstone of your diplomacy, economic interests as the cornerstone of your diplomacy. You have to have an overlap, you have to have some perhaps very formal and explicit coordination mechanisms between the two, although there are other security and diplomacy issues which commerce may not be directly related to. But infrastructure, I want to make a somewhat stronger point. I think infrastructure, when you look at it from the national viewpoint, is actually a network. And it's not network just within sectors. It's not just power plants being networked or roads being networked or railways being networked. Every part of infrastructure is actually networked with every other part. So port does not work unless you have road and rail linkages. Power plant does not work unless you have, of course, the whole transmission line set up. On the other side, the fuel linkages, which we've been facing so many problems with. So I think infrastructure, there is a role, and I've been advocating this, for a sort of separate, perhaps, something like the Planning Commission. Planning Commission, much abused, much sort of maligned in the last few months. But something like that structure, sort of something outside of the ministerial domain, that provides a sort of strategy for these interlinked components of the system. I think that's important. So, how the implementation versus the planning gets separated, that those are issues which need to be resolved. We have lots of complications there. But in terms of the visioning and of just saying, look, this is what our infrastructure system needs to look like. Here are the different components. Here are the complementarities between them. Here are the consistent capacities between different parts of it. That, I think, requires a view that is outside of specific ministerial domains. I think it's very important not to lose sight of that, because it's all very well to say, let's shut down the Planning Commission. It didn't do very much in the last, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Let's give up 5-year plan. I'm all for that. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we do need a strategic perspective somewhere, where it's housed,
whatever you call it,
but can't abandon it.
Right. I'm going to come back to you for the last word, Subir, in a moment. Rasheed, before that, if as someone who sort of has reported on government and seen the various parts, what is the one thing that you feel should be the first to be shrunk or rationalized and to make it more efficient?
But there has to be some kind of, because remember, all this much of the problem in governance is not because of politicians, it's because of bureaucrats. And there is so much of turf war that inter-ministry rivalry is quite legendary. And that's why nothing moves. It was not, if you look at the UPA 2, it was not so much that failure of, say, the Pranab Mukherjee versus Chidambaram. There are a lot of inter-ministerial disputes for taking place, and nobody was, the bureaucrats themselves were not accountable. I would like to see the Prime Minister kind of reining in and having his say in terms of, getting things done. Because if bureaucrats have their way, remember, Indian bureaucracy is not only it has a whole colonial past, it's quite allergic to change. So there is a huge case for reforming bureaucracy. Unless that is done, I think this talk about somebody holding portfolio, not holding it, or merging of ministry is not going to make qualitative difference.
Right. Okay. Subir, last word. What's the one thing? I think Ashok Bhattacharya, in a sense, defined the issue by saying that this is what we all would be looking forward to in the next couple of days as Narendra Modi outlines his cabinet, and really how big it will be or how small it will be. What's the one thing that you would be looking to see and be implemented as a sign of things to come as well?
Well, I'll name two things. One is the domains that the cabinet ministers are given, and two is who are the operating officers, this minister of state rank. I think both of these will signal intent and determination. If we get a large cabinet with sort of ministers of state who are essentially being accommodated, I think I would be a little disappointed with the outcome, given all of the promise that seems to have been has been made over the campaign and subsequently.
Right, and Subir, one more thing: is there one sort of ministry or one let's say theme that you would like to say to us? For instance, we were talking about energy, transport, and so on. What is the one thing that needs most urgent tending to?
I will name three. Food, which is amalgam of many ministries.
Right.
Jobs, again amalgam of many ministries, and infrastructure, which I've just described, requires both a strategic and an operating dimension to be very, very streamlined now.
Right, Subir, thank you very much. I think we've had a very interesting insight and debate on the subject of how many ministries do we really need. I think the bottom line is very few. We're going to be back on the India Hangout. Thanks very much, Subir, Rasheed, Kidwai and Ashok Bhattacharya for joining us.